Welcome, dear viewers, to another special boring history episode. Tonight, we journey into a world where the very act of eating was a daily confrontation with mortality. A time when bread could kill you faster than a sword, and where the finest feast might harbor invisible assassins in every morsel. We're venturing into the medieval period, roughly spanning from the 5th to the 15th centuries, a realm of stone castles rising from mist-shrouded landscapes where candlelit halls echoed with the sounds of gnashing teeth working desperately against food that fought back. Before we begin this rather unsettling culinary journey, I'd love to know, please tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is in your corner of the world. Are you settling into bed with the glow of your screen, or perhaps stirring awake to the dawn? And if you find yourself drawn into these stories of our ancestors' struggles, consider subscribing to join our growing community of history enthusiasts who appreciate the darker threads woven through humanity's tapestry. Let's set the stage, shall we? Picture, if you will, a world where the simple act of breaking your fast could break you instead. Medieval Europe presents us with one of history's most fascinating contradictions. A civilization capable of constructing magnificent cathedrals that still inspire awe today, yet utterly incapable of preventing their own food from becoming a source of constant suffering and death. This is the paradox we'll explore tonight. How a society that produced Dante's Divine Comedy and Gothic architecture could simultaneously create a culinary hell on earth. The medieval diet wasn't merely unappetizing, it was actively hostile to human survival. While we might romanticize the rustic simplicity of those times, the reality was that food in medieval Europe was contaminated, nutritionally bankrupt, and often literally poisonous. The wealthy gorged themselves on rotting meat perfumed with exotic spices to mask the stench of decay, while the poor gnawed on bread so coarse it contained fragments of millstone that gradually ground their teeth to stumps. Let's begin by understanding the fundamental problem that plagued every medieval meal: preservation. In a world without refrigeration, without understanding of bacteria, and without reliable methods of food storage, the battle against spoilage was lost before it began. Meat, when available, was typically consumed in a state of decomposition that would horrify modern diners. The wealthy would slaughter animals in autumn, salt the meat heavily, and consume it throughout the winter months as it slowly putrefied. By spring, what remained would be so riddled with parasites and bacteria that it resembled something closer to biological warfare than sustenance. The spice trade, often celebrated as a romantic economic venture, was actually born from desperate necessity. Those precious saffron threads, cinnamon bark, and peppercorns weren't culinary luxuries, they were chemical warfare against the advancing armies of decay. Medieval cooks would layer these expensive seasonings onto meat, not to enhance flavor, but to create a sensory barricade against the overwhelming stench and taste of corruption. The very phrase "well seasoned" took on a grimly literal meaning when the alternative was starvation. But perhaps nowhere was medieval food more treacherous than in the bread that formed the cornerstone of every diet. Bread was life, and bread was death. The wealthy consumed white bread made from carefully sifted flour, while the poor made do with dark, coarse loaves that were barely recognizable as food. These peasant breads contained not just grain, but whatever could be ground down and mixed in: acorns, bark, sawdust, and frequently small stones from the millstones used in grinding. Archaeological evidence from medieval cemeteries reveals teeth worn down to the gum line, with enamel completely destroyed by the constant grinding against these mineral inclusions. During times of famine, which occurred with terrifying regularity, bread became even more sinister. Desperate millers would add substances that defied imagination: crushed bones, clay, and in the most desperate circumstances, ground up corpses. The chronicles of the time speak of bread that glowed faintly in the dark, caused by phosphorescent fungi, and of loaves that moved with internal parasites. Imagine for a moment sitting down to what medieval people considered a fine meal. The rushes beneath your feet are sodden with months of accumulated food waste, vomit, and worse. The meat before you, perhaps a haunch of pork that's been hanging in the smoky rafters for months, is green around the edges and alive with maggots. These aren't removed before cooking, they're considered additional protein. The bread is so hard it must be soaked in wine or broth before it can be bitten, and even then each mouthful crunches with grit and foreign matter. Water was universally recognized as dangerous to drink, contaminated with human waste, rotting organic matter, and industrial runoff from primitive manufacture. Instead, even children consumed what was euphemistically called small beer, a weak alcoholic beverage that was safer than water but kept the entire population in a state of mild intoxication. Imagine a society where sobriety was literally life-threatening, where clear thinking was a luxury that could cost you your life. The preservation methods available to medieval people were limited and often more dangerous than the spoilage they were meant to prevent. Salt, when available, was used in quantities that would be toxic by modern standards. Meat was frequently preserved in its own rendered fat, creating anaerobic conditions perfect for botulism. Smoking helped somewhat, but medieval smoking techniques often introduced their own toxins. The very processes meant to preserve food often made it actively poisonous. Let me share with you the disturbing case of ergotism, a condition medieval people called St. Anthony's fire. Ergot is a fungus that grows on rye grain, particularly in damp conditions. When consumed, it causes horrific symptoms, burning sensations in the limbs, hallucinations, seizures, and eventually gangrene that causes fingers and toes to blacken and fall off. Entire villages would be affected simultaneously when their grain stores became contaminated. The chronicles describe people dancing maniacally in the streets, claiming to see demons, their extremities rotting away while they were still alive. What makes this particularly chilling is that ergotism was often interpreted as divine punishment or demonic possession. People suffering from ergot poisoning were sometimes burned as witches or forced to undertake painful pilgrimages that only worsened their condition. The very bread that was supposed to sustain them became an instrument of torture, and society's response only amplified their suffering. Modern scientific analysis has revealed just how toxic medieval diets really were. CT scans of medieval skeletons show massive calcium deficiencies, evidence of rickets and scurvy so severe that bones became twisted and deformed. Dental analysis reveals not just the wear patterns from gritty bread, but also the distinctive green staining caused by copper poisoning from contaminated cooking vessels. Medieval people were literally being slowly poisoned by every meal they consumed. Recent archaeological excavations have uncovered medieval cooking areas that read like crime scenes. Lead glazes on pottery leached into acidic foods, creating a constant low-level lead poisoning that manifested in personality changes, cognitive decline, and eventually death. The wealthy, with their elaborate pewter-serving dishes and lead-lined wine cups, actually suffered more severe poisoning than the poor who ate from wooden bowls. The preparation methods themselves were nightmarish by modern standards. Meat was often cooked in massive communal pots that were never properly cleaned, creating a bacterial soup that was continuously added to but never fully empty. These perpetual stews, sometimes called hunter's pot, could bubble away for months, with new ingredients added as old ones were consumed. The bottom layers would be an indescribable mass of decomposed organic matter, bacterial colonies, and parasite. Kitchen hygiene was not merely poor. It was actively hostile to human health. Cooks prepared food with unwashed hands after handling waste, sick animals, and corpses. Raw meat was stored alongside cooked food, cross-contaminating everything. Flies, rats, and other vermin were constant companions in food preparation areas. their droppings and decomposing bodies becoming accidental ingredients. The medieval spice trade also introduced exotic forms of food poisoning. Many imported spices were adulterated with dangerous substances. Lead oxide was added to brighten colors, arsenic compounds were used as preservatives, and toxic plants were mixed in to increase volume. What medieval diners thought were exotic flavors were often the taste of their own slow poisoning. Even the wealthy who could afford the finest ingredients faced unique challenges. Their elaborate feasts featured dishes that were as much about display as nutrition. Peacocks were roasted and then redressed in their plumage, creating beautiful but bacteria-laden centerpieces. Swan, considered the height of luxury, was notorious for harboring parasites that caused severe intestinal distress. The more exotic and expensive the food, the more likely it was to be dangerous. Let me tell you about the disturbing practice of medieval food coloring. In an age where appearance was crucial to establishing social status, cooks would go to horrific lengths to create visually impressive dishes. They used toxic substances like vermilion, mercury sulfide to create red colors, verdigris, copper acetate for green, and lead-based compounds for various hues. These weren't trace amounts. Medieval recipe books call for these substances by the spoonful. The most beautiful dishes were often the most lethal. The poor faced different but equally terrible challenges. Their diet consisted primarily of grain porridge, so watery it was more like soup, vegetables that were often past spoilage, and occasional scraps of meat, so rotten that only heavy seasoning with wild herbs could make them edible. These wild seasonings often included plants that were mildly toxic, creating a daily game of Russian roulette with each meal. Medieval preservation techniques often created foods that were technically edible but nutritionally void. Cheese, for instance, was often aged in conditions that allowed beneficial bacteria to be overwhelmed by harmful ones. The resulting product might last longer, but it provided little nutrition and often caused severe digestive distress. Similarly, preserved fish was packed in salt so heavily that it had to be soaked for days before consumption, leaching out most of its nutritional value. The drinking vessels themselves were sources of contamination. Leather bottles for carrying liquids were tanned with substances that leached into whatever they contained. Wooden cups and bowls were carved with tools that left metal shavings behind, and these vessels could never be truly cleaned, harboring bacteria in their porous surfaces indefinitely. Seasonal variations made the situation even worse. Spring was known as the hunger gap, the time when winter stores were exhausted but new crops weren't yet ready. During these months, people would consume anything remotely edible: grass soups, boiled leather, even clay mixed with what little grain remained. These desperation foods often caused more harm than the hunger they were meant to alleviate. The wealthy had their own seasonal challenge. Summer feasts in the heat often became exercises in mass food poisoning, as elaborate dishes spoiled within hours of preparation. The tradition of medieval banquets lasting for days meant that food consumed on the final day had been sitting in warm, unsanitary conditions for far too long to be safe. Even the most basic preparation techniques were fraught with danger. Cooking fires were built with whatever fuel was available, often dried animal dung, rotting wood, or even bones. The smoke from these fires would impart flavors that modern palates would find revolting, while also depositing carcinogenic compounds directly onto the food being prepared. Medieval people developed what modern food scientists recognize as a form of collective Stockholm syndrome regarding their diet. They praised foods that were actively harmful, developing cultural traditions around consumption patterns that maximized rather than minimized food-related illness. Certain foods that caused vivid hallucinations were considered delicacies, while others that induced violent purging were thought to be particularly healthful. The monastery kitchens, which we might imagine were cleaner and safer, were often the worst offenders. Monastic communities would share single cooking vessels among hundreds of people, with no understanding of disease transmission. Their commitment to eating spoiled food as a form of penance meant that religious communities often suffered higher rates of food poisoning than secular ones. Recent scientific analysis of preserved medieval tissues has revealed the full extent of nutritional deficiencies suffered by our ancestors. Bone analysis shows that even wealthy individuals suffered from chronic malnutrition, their bodies depleted of essential vitamins and minerals. Hair samples, when available, show levels of heavy metal poisoning that would be considered acute toxicity by modern standards. Perhaps most disturbing is evidence of deliberate food contamination as a form of warfare and political control. Rival nobles would sometimes arrange for their enemies' grain supplies to be infected with ergot, effectively conducting chemical warfare through the food supply. Even more chilling, some rulers used controlled food poisoning as a method of eliminating political rivals while maintaining plausible deniability. The medieval understanding of nutrition was not merely incomplete, it was actively destructive. Medical texts of the time, written by learned physicians who had studied the ancient Greek humoral theory, recommended dietary practices that modern science recognizes as accelerating malnutrition. They believed that the poor should eat different foods than the wealthy based on their social station, creating deliberate nutritional apartheid that weakened entire classes of society. The wealthy were prescribed warming foods like wine and meat, while peasants were told to consume cooling foods like gruel and root vegetables, a system that ensured the working class remained perpetually malnourished and weak. The theory of humors dominated medieval dietary thinking with catastrophic results. Physicians believed that all foods possessed inherent qualities: hot, cold, wet, or dry, and that these must be balanced according to an individual's temperament and social rank. This pseudo-scientific approach led to dietary restrictions that were often the opposite of what the body actually needed. Pregnant women, for instance, were forbidden from eating hot foods like fresh fruits and vegetables, depriving them of vital nutrients during the most crucial time. Children were given diets designed to keep them cool and docile, systematically stunting their growth and cognitive development. Trade routes that brought exotic foods also brought exotic diseases, but the contamination went far deeper than anyone realized at the time. Spices from distant lands carried bacteria and parasites that European digestive systems had never encountered, but they also carried something more insidious. The pathogens would adapt and evolve in the bellies of European consumers, creating new strains of foodborne illness that were uniquely virulent. What medieval people celebrated as culinary sophistication was often their own gradual biological colonization by foreign pathogens that were evolving specifically to exploit European physiology. The very concept of freshness was alien to medieval thinking, but this wasn't simply ignorance. It was a survival strategy born from bitter experience. Food was expected to be aged, fermented, or preserved in some way before consumption, because fresh food was associated with the swift arrival of death. Fresh vegetables were considered dangerous, fit only for animals, because the medieval understanding of seasonal eating was that anything growing from the ground was contaminated by the miasma, the poisonous air that they believed rose from the earth itself. This belief system, while protecting people from some forms of contamination, deprived them of essential vitamins and created epidemic levels of diseases like scurvy and birra. But here's where the medieval food crisis becomes truly horrifying. Seasonal starvation was so predictable that it was built into the social and economic structure of feudalism itself. Lords would deliberately calculate how little food was needed to keep their serfs alive through winter, hoarding surplus not for security but as a form of population control. The spring hunger was not a natural disaster. It was engineered scarcity designed to keep the peasant class desperate and dependent. Medieval food preparation was a form of slow-motion Russian roulette played out over lifetimes, but it was also a complex social ritual that reinforced hierarchies of suffering. Every meal was a gamble against spoilage, contamination, and toxicity, but who took which risks depended entirely on social status. The human cost was staggering. Life expectancy was shortened not just by disease and warfare, but by the very act of eating. Food wasn't just scarce, It was actively hostile to human life, and society was organized to ensure that this hostility fell most heavily on those least able to defend themselves. Archaeological excavations of medieval latrines paint a vivid picture of the digestive chaos that defined daily life, but they also reveal the systematic nature of medieval suffering. These waste deposits contain evidence of constant parasitic infections, undigested food fragments that suggest severe malabsorption, and traces of toxic substances that reveal the true nature of medieval cuisine. But more telling are the patterns. The evidence shows that intestinal distress followed predictable cycles linked to social events, harvest seasons, and trade routes. Our ancestors lived in a state of perpetual digestive distress that we can barely comprehend. But it wasn't random suffering. It was organized, systematic, and often deliberate. The wealthy developed elaborate rituals around their dangerous eating habits, turning the consumption of toxic food into displays of power and sophistication. They would compete to see who could consume the most exotic and therefore most dangerous foods, viewing survival as proof of divine favor and superior breeding. These competitive feasts often resulted in mass poisonings that were celebrated as successful entertainment. Consider the disturbing case of medieval honey, which should have been one of the safer foods available. Medieval beekeepers, lacking understanding of bee biology, would often locate their hives near plants that produced toxic nectar. The resulting honey would be psychoactive at best and lethal at worst. Rhododendron honey produced by bees feeding on azalea and rhododendron flowers would cause hallucinations, convulsions, and cardiac arrest. Yet because honey was rare and expensive, even obviously contaminated honey was consumed as a luxury item. The medieval practice of bleeding meat, allowing animals to bleed slowly to death while conscious, wasn't just cruelty. It was based on the belief that adrenaline and fear would improve the meat's flavor and nutritional properties. This practice actually made the meat more dangerous by allowing stress hormones and bacterial contamination to saturate the tissue. The animal's terror was literally absorbed into the food that would nourish their killer. Medieval kitchens were architectural marvels of inefficiency and contamination. The great hearths that we admire in castle tours were designed to produce maximum smoke and minimum heat control, ensuring that food was either charred beyond recognition or dangerously undercooked. The magnificent spit roasting mechanisms that turned whole animals were marvels of engineering that guaranteed uneven cooking, creating perfectly prepared surfaces surrounding raw bacteria-laden interior. Servants who worked in these kitchens lived abbreviated lives of constant illness, their bodies breaking down from continuous exposure to smoke, heat, and contaminated food. They were expected to taste every dish before it was served to their masters, making them inadvertent food testers who absorbed the cumulative toxicity of hundreds of dangerous meals. Their shortened lifespans were considered normal. Kitchen work was understood to be inherently fatal, and servants were replaced as casually as spoiled ingredients. The medieval wine industry, often romanticized today, was actually a sophisticated system for creating alcoholic poison. Wine was frequently adulterated with lead compounds to improve clarity and sweetness, a practice that caused widespread neurological damage among the wealthy who could afford to drink wine regularly. The lead poisoning was so common that it was considered a mark of sophistication to suffer from the tremors and cognitive decline that marked chronic lead exposure. Medieval brewing practices were no safer. Beer was often contaminated during the brewing process with toxic plants that grew wild around breweries. Hops, now essential to beer production, were not universally used, and brewers instead relied on combinations of herbs that frequently included plants with psychoactive or toxic property. Medieval ales were often mildly hallucinogenic, keeping entire populations in altered states of consciousness that made the suffering of daily life more bearable. Let me tell you about the horrifying practice of medieval food storage in urban areas. In cities like London and Paris, food was stored in buildings that were shared with animals, workshops, and waste processing areas. Grain stores were contaminated with everything from mercury compounds used in hat making to arsenic from metalworking. The concentration of people in activities meant that food contamination was not accidental. It was inevitable and systematic. The medieval guild system, while organizing craft production, also systematized food contamination. Bakers' guilds had regulations that actually required the addition of certain adulterants to bread, not to improve nutrition, but to maximize profit and ensure consistent texture. These guild-mandated additives included ground limestone, clay, and even powdered bone, creating an official system for poisoning the population. Medieval people developed tolerance to levels of food contamination that would kill modern humans within days. Their digestive systems, constantly assaulted by toxins and pathogens, became hardened through survival of the fittest on a cellular level. Those who couldn't adapt to eating contaminated food simply died, leaving behind populations with enhanced tolerance for dietary toxins but shortened lifespans and chronic health problems. The irony is profound. While medieval people created some of humanity's greatest artistic and intellectual achievements, they were slowly killing themselves with every bite they took. Their cathedrals still inspire us centuries later, but their food would hospitalize us within hours. They mastered the art of preserving stone and parchment for eternity, but couldn't keep a piece of meat safe for a week. They created sublime music and poetry while their bodies slowly deteriorated from nutritional deficiencies that turned their bones to chalk and their teeth to powder. Modern food scientists studying medieval preservation techniques have discovered that many traditional methods actually accelerated rather than prevented spoilage under medieval conditions. Without understanding of bacterial growth, medieval people often created perfect environments for the most dangerous pathogens to flourish. Their preservation techniques were elaborate rituals that provided psychological comfort, while offering little actual protection. These methods were passed down through generations not because they worked, but because they were the only options available, creating traditions of slow poisoning that were mistaken for wisdom. Recent DNA analysis of medieval coprolites, preserved human waste, has revealed the true scope of medieval dietary suffering. These samples contain evidence of parasitic loads that would be considered fatal by modern standards, alongside genetic material from dozens of different pathogens that medieval digestive systems somehow managed to coexist with. The human gut microbiome in medieval times was less a healthy ecosystem, and more a battlefield where survival meant learning to live with multiple simultaneous infections. Perhaps most chilling of all is the discovery that medieval people had developed cultural and religious frameworks that celebrated suffering through food. Fasting was not just spiritual practice, it was often the healthiest thing they could do for their bodies, giving their digestive systems brief respites from the constant assault of contaminated nutrition. The concept of penance through dietary suffering made sense in a world where every meal was already a form of self-inflicted torture. The medieval feast, the pinnacle of social celebration, was actually a ritualized form of mass poisoning. Recent analysis of medieval banquet menus reveals combinations of foods that were almost certainly designed to cause illness, whether intentionally or through ignorance. Dishes that combined preserved fish with dairy products, heavy wines with raw vegetables, and multiple types of aged meat created chemical reactions in the digestive system that produced toxins more dangerous than any individual ingredient. Thank you for spending this time with me, exploring the darker chapters of our culinary heritage. As you drift off tonight, perhaps pause for a moment to appreciate the miracle of your own dinner plate. The safety, the abundance, the simple fact that your food isn't actively trying to kill you. Think of those medieval souls huddled around their cooking fires, making the best of bread that crunched with stone fragments and meat that glowed with bacterial phosphorescence, finding sustenance and even joy in meals that would terrify us to death. Sleep well, knowing that the long struggle between humanity and hunger has given way to an age where food is our ally, not our enemy. Good night.